So tonight I want to talk to you guys about gaming narratives. More specifically, I guess I want to just talk about really good stories in video games. Games that just knocked it out the park when it came to story, and games that kept me hooked and invested. Because ultimately, for me, in my personal opinion, game mechanics do matter to a point for me. Style of game doesn't really matter, as long as the biggest thing that counts for me in games is narrative and story. Those are the two big things that sucked me in. Growing up as a kid, I played a lot of NES N64 games, and a lot of those games didn't really come with story type stuff. The first time I ever encountered like an actual narrative in gaming where it felt like I was part of a story, I feel like it was Ocarina of Time. And the funny thing is that Ocarina of Time doesn't even really have a story. It's just Ocarina of Time. But it was more than anything else I had played at the time. So it really like sucked me in. And that's when I found out that you could actually find games that were more story driven. I think that's also why I gravitated towards RPGs a lot, because a lot of RPGs like needed to have really interesting, solid story that like stood out to you. That for me was for sure Ocarina of Time and Final Fantasy VII. I think the trifecta would probably, for me, at the start of like getting into games like that were RPGs, had good narrative, story content, was probably I'm not really counting Ocarina of Time as like a full-on RPG. I feel like that's more of an adventure title, but still, it was Ocarina of Time, Final Fantasy VII, and probably Baldur's Gate. So like I was playing on three different things. I was playing Ocarina of Time for 64, I was playing Baldur's Gate on PC, and I was playing Final Fantasy VII on PlayStation 1. Those were like the trifecta that got me into like, wow, games can be more than just point, shoot, and jump on shit. Who would have thought, right? And since I was a big fantasy nerd, you know, I'm still a big fantasy nerd, but I read tons of fantasy stuff back in the day. Like I was big into Dungeons and Dragons. So like when Baldur's Gate came out, clearly off of the Forgotten Realms series, which is, you know, a campaign based in Dungeons and Dragons, I gravitated towards that immediately. An RPG benefits heavily off of its narrative and its story, right? So an RPG almost needs to have a good story. For me, at least, the story has to sell it, because I'm not going to sit there and play a game that takes you 100 hours to beat. Because let's be fair, yeah, some people can like go crazy and they can grind and they can, you know, they can probably rush through a game in like 50 some hours. Because I mean, I used to know friends of mine that would just skip the story and play the game, and I thought that was like weird to me, because I was like, the game is mainly about the story. The gameplay is fun, but it's grindy. They prefer to play the grindy parts of the game and just skip the story. And they're like, I don't know what Final Fantasy VII was about, but I had fun playing it. And it's like, okay. I mean, and to be fair, I don't think a lot of us knew what Final Fantasy VII was about until way later. Final Fantasy VII was an entry point for a lot of people, to be honest. My earlier memories are a bit spotty, but I think Final Fantasy III on SNES was probably my first main story game. Oh, word, okay. But definitely was always big on the story drive. Hooked on Final Fantasy after 3, Stone Keep on PC DOS. Ooh, Stone Keep, what is that? We're gonna go down memory lane right here. Also, I love GOG games because they are DRM free. My early years of gaming were mostly Pokemon and wrestling games, so I was a late bloomer when playing games for the narrative kind of thing. That's totally fair. That's totally fair. And I mean, I knew friends of mine who like hated those types of games though. Like weren't even like open to the fact. They were like, oh, this got a lot of story in it, I don't want to play it. Where I was reading fantasy books, my friends were reading comic books, and I've got nothing against comic books. I mean, I read some manga now. But like, you know, I was reading fantasy books and I was like, you like all these kind of comics and stuff with these crazy things, you would love these fantasy books. They're like, ain't got pictures in it, I ain't reading it. So, you know, there's always people that have like different preferences for things. Yo, this is straight up those old school, like this is like Shadowgate. Arcanum was wild, dude. This was also, these were my jam. Anytime I saw a box for a game and it looked like this, and it didn't say it was a strategy game, I bought it. Because I also just hate strategy games. So I never liked tactics games. I did, however, like games like Baldur's Gate. And they were like the true, like, like just plain RPG type games. And Arcanum was badass. This game was also very hard. This guy would like a word with you. See, and it's the style too, though, you know? But see, I never liked Final Fantasy Tactics at all. You know the closest game, you know the most time I ever put into a tactics game? Right there. That's the closest I ever got into putting any work into a tactics game, and I never finished it because guess what? I hate tactics gameplay. So guess how far I got into that game? Not very far. I'll tell you a second game that's not Persona or SMT related. I played a little bit of that, and that was pretty fun. And in fact, I like this combat better than Devil Survivor. Soul Reaver 2 is a game that literally doesn't have any boss fights in it, and it's an amazing game. I was a big fan of Soul Reaver 1, and that's what got me into Legacy of Kain as a whole. The storyline is so well written in this game. The lore is so interesting about how they do vampires and angels and demons and things like that. It's so good that when Soul Reaver 2 came out and there was no boss battles, it didn't matter because the storyline was that good. That is the power of good narrative at work. When you play through a whole game and you don't even really give a shit that there's no boss battles. I think that's what's missing in a lot of games today, is that while yeah, it doesn't sound like a typical standard revenge story, yes, but it's set in a weird and different world that has its own lore about how vampires work, comparing them to angels and like all this kind of stuff. And it's so unique is that that's what helps make you more interested. It makes you more intrigued because it is different than what you're normally used to seeing. That's where things in today's world I feel miss the mark. They've got interesting mechanics, they've got interesting systems built out. Even Soul Hackers 2 has a very interesting story to it. It's just not really fleshed out. It doesn't make me feel intrigued to know more. Soul Hackers 2 does feel like a very standard cyberpunk world. It's cool, but it's only cool for like a couple hours for me. Soul Reaver 2 had me invested. Soul Reaver 1 and 2 had me invested throughout because I wanted to know more. I already knew they were breaking conventional tropes with what a vampire is and a revenge story. I wanted to know more. Plus, revenge stories are cool. And when they're set into a world with lore that's completely different than what you're used to getting, it makes it intriguing. And that's what I feel like is missing in a lot of games today. A lot of games today are afraid to go weird. They're afraid to do something different and unconventional because they care more about what sells. Or they care more about being safe because they know it'll sell. This is why indie games are reigning king right now. Indie games are reigning king is because indie games are taking risks and they're doing interesting things that AAA and modern gaming companies are not doing anymore. If we're gonna go full narrative, I mean the biggest ones that pop into my brain are of course Persona. I'm not gonna go too heavy on it other than the fact that Persona games are they're good. They've been evolving in such a good way year after year. The storylines are always well written, the characters are well fleshed out, there's plenty to do, and there's plenty to feel like that you're part of that narrative. As far as like a true good full-blown JRPG experience, Persona all the way, 1000%. Then on the other spectrum, you've got Yakuza. Simply at its core, a brawler, but with all the stuff with the stat systems and everything, with the RPG elements, it's like the perfect like hybrid game. That the storyline is fantastic. It's been very hard to have a storyline that tops Yakuza in my opinion. It feels like you're literally playing a Yakuza drama, and that's what I like about it. I love that about the game. I would almost throw Silent Hill 2 in there. And the reason why I say Silent Hill 2 specifically is because of how crazy deep the story goes in that game. Depending on your actions depends on where you go in that game. And for a survival horror game to have that kind of element into it, where what you do and the choices you make directly influence the outcome of the game, and just the way they set that whole world up, interesting, unique, different, not your typical like Resident Evil zombie slasher game. You know, it's a little bit more than that. Some things could be a little, you know, of its time, you know, but for the most part, Silent Hill 2 is another one of those narrative driven games that is like A tier, S tier. It's like S tier in my book. narrative in games have to be willing to take risks. They have to be willing to be unique in some way. That's what originally attracted me to Persona when I was tired of the Final Fantasy loop. I was playing through Final Fantasies. I was kind of done with them, and they were just becoming samey for me. And Persona was that breath of fresh air. Persona was that different RPG that had a unique style to it that stood out over any other RPG at the time. Wolf Among Us stood out to me with a very unique story that wasn't tied to, like, you know, Walking Dead or something like that. It was a story about fables and legends and done in a very interesting setting. I liked it a lot. And I'm very excited for Wolf Among Us 2. I really hope that ends up being good. It's games like that that break the mold. Silent Hill 2 for a survival horror game, where people are so used to Resident Evil, and how Resident Evil, you know, is basically just a zombie slasher. It does have a story. I'm not saying that the story of Resident Evil is bad by any means, but Silent Hill went that extra psychological route that is different. I'm gonna throw in Wolfenstein and Modern Warfare. Now, they fucked it up with Youngbloods, but Wolfenstein: The New Order and Wolfenstein 2: The New Colossus are fantastic dude bro arcade shoot 'em up games. I love that so much. It makes you feel badass. They're fun to play. The storyline is so just raw in those games. They don't really hold back, which is what I really like about them. I highly recommend Wolfenstein. Modern Warfare, to me, and I always have to go back to Modern Warfare 2, because Modern Warfare 2 had so much interesting twists and turns in the narrative. The first one did too. The third one was okay, but specifically what stands out to me is Modern Warfare 2. That was the first Call of Duty I ever really got into, because I was not into military shooters at all. If it looked realistic to me, I didn't like it. I was like, that's boring to me. I never liked World War I, World War II stuff. I didn't like any of that stuff. It never appealed to me. Was never a history buff kind of person. Didn't care. If I saw a shooty game, it had to be like Wolfenstein or Doom or Halo or Resistance or something like that. It had to be something with some fantastical or sci-fi element to it for me to get interested in it. Modern Warfare 2 was the first one that I actually got into and was very impressed by what they pulled off in the narrative for the single player. There's a lot of things to love about gaming, and everybody likes games for their own reasons. They like playing games for their own reasons, and making this basically just shows you more of what I appreciate and what I look for in my games. I am very much so more into good character development, good story, things that can suck me in and get me interested and that are intriguing enough to spark my attention. Lots of new games today don't do that. They're so cookie cutter. They're more designed to either sell you on nostalgia or to try to throw in something additional that just is like, well, it's the name of something you used to know, so you'll buy it. And that's really sad. That's really sad nowadays. It's very hard to find a game that really steps up to the plate and delivers good characters, good story. In recent time, the only games I could think of are Persona 5, Persona 5 Royal, Ghost of Tsushima, and probably God of War. Those have fantastic narratives that are like top tier in my opinion. And I just wish more game companies would put more work into that part of it, because taking a risk and making something unique that stands out, that's not like the rest, it's not like, oh, this is your standard RPG, this is your standard action fighter, whatever. It's got a story that's okay enough. And that's the thing. A lot of times these stories aren't that they're bad. They're just okay. They're just kind of like mid-tier stories. And a lot of times when you've got a game, especially like an RPG that takes you like 80 to 100 hours to complete, a mid-tier story doesn't cut it. That's why I stopped playing Soul Hackers 2. That's why I stopped playing Shin Megami Tensei 5. That's why when a narrative is good, I've replayed Persona 5 numerous times, because the narrative and the characters are good and well fleshed out and written, and it makes that 100 plus hours of gameplay worth it. But that's just my opinion. Let me know what you guys think in the comments down below. Remember to like and subscribe, and hit the little bell button and tickle the Okay, bye.